clever cat. Every morning, Tibbs waited by his front door. And waited, and waited, and waited, and waited. And waited and waited until someone noticed him. "I suppose you want your breakfast," said Mrs. Ford, his owner. "Well, you're just going to have to wait."
"Get out of my way, cat," shouted Mr. Ford. "I'm late for work."
"Not now," said Miss Ford. "I'm late for school." "Move, stupid," said Master Ford. Tibbs waited and waited and waited until Mrs. Ford noticed him again. "Why can't you feed yourself, you great fat lump? You always make me late." Finally, Tibbs had his breakfast. And so it went, day in and day out, waiting for breakfast, waiting for lunch, waiting for dinner. One morning, Tibbs could take it no longer. He climbed up the cupboard and got down his own cat food. He opened the can, served himself a generous portion, and started to eat. The house went very quiet. No one was rushing. Everyone was looking at him. "What a clever cat," said Mrs. Ford. "I had no idea."
"Amazing,"
said Mr. Ford. "Wow," said Miss and Master Ford. The next day, Mrs. Ford gave Tibbs his own front door key. "Try it out," she said. He did. "What a clever cat," said Mrs. Ford, rushing off to work. The day after that, Mrs. Ford gave Tibbs her cash card. "I forgot to pick you up some cat food," she said. "Do you think you can take out some cash and buy yourself some dinner?" Tibbs nodded. "Clever cat," said Mrs. Ford. "Must rush." Tibbs drew some cash and bought 2 cans of cat food. The neighbors were impressed. "I wish we had a clever cat who could do its own shopping," they said, looking down at their lazy kitties snoozing in the sun. The lazy kitties opened their eyes for a moment and winked at each other. Then they went back to snoozing. Tibbs tried snoozing himself, but he was restless and couldn't. He went out for a stroll. It was lunchtime, and Tibbs was feeling hungry. He got out some cash from the machine and went into a cafe. What fine food! How awful cat food tasted in comparison! However had he put up with it all these years? Tibbs left a big tip for the waitress. The cafe manager gave him a wave as he left. The customers smiled at him. The next day, Tibbs went shopping, and then went to a movie. Every day there was something different to do and new friends to make. How much fun life could be! Snoozing in the day was for dumb cats. What a waste of time. Tibbs was just on his way out to have breakfast at his favorite cafe when Mr. and Mrs. Ford stopped him. Mrs. Ford snatched back her cash card.
"We need to talk," said Mr. Ford. "You're a very clever cat, but a very expensive one to keep. You're going to have to help out with the bills."
"We need rent money from you also," added Mrs. Ford. "I think you need to find a job." Tibbs went to see the manager at his favorite cafe about a job.
"Okay," said the manager. "I'll try you out as a waiter."
Tibbs worked all day, carrying this, carrying that, never any rest. By the end of the day, Tibbs was exhausted. He still had his own meal to make at home and his dishes to wash up afterwards. And when Tibbs got paid at the end of the week, most of his money went to bills and rent. He only had enough left over to buy himself cat food. Tibbs was so tired on Monday morning that he failed to get up. When he arrived at work late, the manager took him aside.
"I've had a lot of complaints about you from customers," he said. "You make people wait too long for their meals. Sorry, but I have to let you go."
When Mr. and Mrs. Ford learned that Tibbs didn't have a job anymore, they were not very sympathetic.
"You better find another job quick," said Mr. Ford. "We need your money coming in."
Tibbs went outside. All the other cats were happily snoozing without a care in the world. The next morning, Tibbs waited by the front door. And waited, and waited, and waited. "Where's your key?" said Mrs. Ford. Tibbs looked blank. And then he waited, and waited, and waited for breakfast. "Forgotten how to feed yourself, I suppose?" said Mrs. Ford. "Well, don't expect me to help you." Tibbs looked blank. Then he waited, and waited, and waited. He didn't mind. Finally, the next day, Mrs. Ford broke down and fed Tibbs herself. "Dumb cat," she said, rushing off to work. Tibbs found a nice sunny spot outside and curled up and began to snooze. The other cats on the street opened their eyes for a moment and winked at each other as if to say, "Finally, a clever cat." The end. Thank you for joining me.